Welcome to the deep dive. We sift through stacks of research, articles, all sorts of sources, really, to pull out the key insights. The idea is to give you a shortcut, to getting properly informed, often with some pretty surprising stuff along the way. And today, we're diving into something most of us, well, we think we know it backwards and forwards, World War II. Now, for people in the West, Americans, Brits, Australians, Canadians, Western Europeans, the usual story, 1939 to 1945, it's always framed as Hitler's war. It's everywhere in our culture, right? Like Casablanca or uh, Inglorious Bastards. Hitler's the ultimate bad guy. Comparing someone to Hitler, still the worst insult. It kind of unites everyone against Nazism. And that story, it really centers on Nazi Germany as the main antagonist, the war starting in Europe.
Okay, but let's unpack this a bit. While that Western view, it definitely has a solid basis, right? No question. But what if we told you that from other viewpoints, say Moscow or Beijing, Pyongyang, Hanoi, this massive conflict we call World War II, wasn't really seen as Hitler's war at all? I mean, for many, the dates are different too. Maybe it starts in 31, not 39.
Maybe it ends later than May 45. So if we look at that bigger time frame, that wider geography, is there a common thread? Maybe a different central figure, someone who was actually in power for that whole longer period, someone whose armies fought across Asia and Europe, whose empire stretched across Eurasia, where most of the fighting, most of the casualties happened, and someone who, in the end, came out the victor with a massively bigger empire. Who fits that bill?
Yeah, and that's what's truly fascinating here, what we're really digging into today. If you connect all those dots, the bigger global picture, and really consider the whole span from Japan invading Manchuria back in September 31, right through to Japan's final surrender in September of 45. The argument, well, it shifts profoundly. It suggests maybe it wasn't Hitler's war, but Joseph Stalin's war. I mean, he was alive. He was in power for that entire stretch, this huge territory, coveted by both main Axis powers, Germany and Japan, and ultimately he beat them both. But the cost, my God, the cost was just unfathomable. Nearly 30 million Soviet lives lost, an absolutely staggering human price. But alongside that, a victory and an expansion that fundamentally reshaped the world map and the whole geopolitical landscape, really.
Right. So our mission in this deep dive is to explore the sources that lay out this, well, pretty radical reevaluation. We want to give you that shortcut to understanding a perspective that might just spark some big aha moments about this crucial period. We're looking at research that digs into Stalin's role, revealing stuff that's often surprising, often overlooked, or maybe just downplayed in standard Western histories. A story of cynical, opportunistic strategy. So let's start by winding the clock back, way back. Let's look at what we could call Stalin's long game.
Okay, yeah. To really get Stalin's approach later on, you have to understand the Bolsheviks' worldview right from the start, from 1917. Lenin and his crew, they believed in something called world revolution and revolutionary defeatism. This wasn't traditional diplomacy, not even close. It was this core belief that the workers' revolution would actually come out of imperialist war, especially for the countries that lost. As early as November 1920, Lenin gave this incredibly cynical instruction. He said, if we are obliged to tolerate such scoundrels as the capitalist thieves, it is our direct duty to make them turn their knives against each other.
Wow. That's a chilling way to look at international relations. Basically stir up trouble between your enemies. Did this kind of cynical pragmatism show up early on in the first years of the Soviet state?
Well, absolutely. You see this pragmatism, this revolutionary opportunism right away. Take the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918, a really harsh peace treaty with Germany. Russia lost huge amounts of territory. But even then, the Russians weren't just rolling over. Witnesses saw them throwing propaganda leaflets out of train windows aimed right at German soldiers, trying to spread the revolution. And maybe even more surprising, Leon Trotsky, a top Bolshevik, actually asked the Western allies for help against the Germans who were invading them. He asked France for help moving the capital from Petrograd to Moscow. He invited British Marines to Murmansk to guard war supplies. He even floated the idea of British and American officers training the new Red Army.
Seriously,
Yep.
while preaching world revolution against those same powers.
Exactly. It wasn't about ideological purity. It was pure, unadulterated opportunism, whatever it took to make sure the Soviet state survived.
So, right from the get-go, survival and pushing for world revolution, that trumped everything else. Traditional diplomacy, even ideological consistency, it all took a back seat.
Yeah.
How did they formalize this global subversion thing beyond just these opportunistic moves?
Well, they formalized it pretty quickly with the Third International, usually called the Comintern, set up in March 1919. This wasn't just a talking shop for friendly socialists. No.
Yeah.
It was basically Moscow's central command center for communist parties worldwide, explicitly dedicated to overthrowing capitalist governments. And the rules for joining, the 21 conditions of membership for national communist parties, they were sections of the Executive Committee, the ECCI in Moscow. They were incredibly strict and very revealing about what they were really up to.
Okay, tell us more about those conditions. What did they actually demand?
Well, Condition 2, for example, it required parties to split their organizations into legal and illegal branches, essentially demanding that these national communist parties operate like shadow governments ready to seize power. And it got even more direct when it came to the military. Condition 4 demanded persistent and systematic propaganda and agitation among the armed forces, forming communist nuclei in every military unit of other countries. Imagine that. Actively trying to undermine other nations' armies from the inside.
That's incredible.
Then he had Condition 15. It required members to render selflessly devoted assistance to the USSR, to get workers to sabotage weapons shipments to Soviet enemies, and to carry on propaganda, legal or illegal, among any foreign troops sent to strangle the Workers' Republic.
That's just astonishing. So the core insight here really is that Soviet foreign policy wasn't just foreign policy in the normal sense. It was inherently subversive from day one. Traditional diplomacy was just a tool to exploit weaknesses and push for revolution, not about peaceful coexistence at all.
Precisely. And it raises that key question. How much was Soviet foreign policy about normal diplomatic interest versus this long-term goal of global revolutionary subversion? The evidence, honestly, it overwhelmingly suggests that for the Bolsheviks, and definitely later for Stalin, diplomacy was just a tactic, a temporary measure. The real goal was always world revolution, using conflicts between capitalist powers, just like Lenin said.
Right. And speaking of those internal conflicts, Stalin comes onto the scene after Lenin dies in January 1924. He takes charge. Often described as a born street fighter, always landing on top. Did his personal views line up with this Leninist idea of revolutionary defeatism?
Oh, absolutely. Stalin wasn't just paying lip service to Lenin's revolutionary defeatism. It was central to his whole way of thinking, his strategy. He hammers this home in his big work, Foundations of Leninism from 1924. And he explicitly said in January 1925, something like, had the two chief coalitions of capitalist countries not been engaged in mortal combat, it is doubtful whether the Soviet power would have survived, unquote one. That tells you everything, doesn't it? He saw conflict between others, not just as a danger, but as an opportunity, a dynamic to exploit to build Soviet power, both at home and abroad.
So he wasn't just watching the capitalist world burn. He was actively trying to position the Soviet Union to benefit from the flames. How did that play out in their early diplomacy and economic deals?
You see the strategic exploitation in a few key moves in the 1920s. Look at the Anglo-Soviet Trade Agreement in March 1921. London was eager for trade, wanted to open up those Soviet markets. But Lenin had already ditched all the old Tsarist debts back in 1918, basically defaulted. Eventually, the Soviets ran out of the Tsarist gold they'd been using for foreign deals. That put them in a tough spot financially.
Okay, so they needed money. What was their solution? How did they get around that?
They found what they saw as a more favorable deal. The Treaty of Rapallo in 1922 with Germany, the other European outcast at the time. Through Rapallo, Berlin gave the Soviets crucial credit, which they desperately needed. But, and this is the really crucial part, it had a secret clause. This clause let German companies build and test new weapons on Soviet soil.
Ah, getting around the Versailles Treaty rules.
Exactly. It let Germany secretly rearm, breaking the Versailles rules while also making tensions worse between Germany and the Allies. It was a perfect, cynical example of Lenin's idea. Make the capitalist thieves turn their knives against each other.
That's fascinating, that early maneuvering. But Stalin also pushed through huge internal changes, like collectivizing agriculture. How did the absolutely horrific domestic policy, the famines and everything, fit into his long-term external strategy?
Right, Stalin's collectivization, starting with a January 1930 Politburo resolution on measures for the elimination of kulak households. It was genocidal. No other word for it. It led directly to the terrible famine of 1932-33, affecting tens of millions. There were even reports of widespread cannibalism in secret police files. It's horrifying. But this mass deportation, the elimination of independent farmers, served a brutal purpose. It created a bottomless supply of forced labor for Stalin's huge industrialization projects. Things like the infamous White Sea-Baltic Canal, built by slave labor. Death rates in some gulag camps like Kolyma up in Siberia were unbelievable, maybe 50%. It was a ruthless way to squeeze out resources and build up the industrial and military base for a future war.
Chilling to think how directly that human cost was linked to military goals. But here's a twist that seems Well, unexpected. American influence playing a role in this Soviet modernization. How did it happen?
Yeah, the American influence, it was surprisingly widespread in the early 30s. So many American specialists were involved in Stalin's planned economy that they even had their own expat newspaper, the Moscow News. And get this, the Kolkhoz model. You know, the icon of Stalinist collective farming. It was actually based on an American capitalist setup. Thomas D. Campbell's massive 95,000-acre Wheat King farm out in Montana.
Seriously, a state-run collective farm based on a private American mega farm.
I know, it sounds bizarre. But Stalin wasn't just watching, he was actively hiring American experts. He was sending spies to U.S. companies to steal technology and modernize his military industry. And the ambition was enormous. Marshal Tukhachevsky, back in 1930, set this target of producing 50,000 tanks and 40,000 warplanes annually. Now, that was probably unrealistic, but it shows this incredibly aggressive military focus right from the start, way beyond just defending themselves.
So the U.S. connection went deeper than just farm models. Roosevelt recognizing the USSR in 1933 despite opposition at home. That seems like a huge moment. It opened a door for Stalin, didn't it? Giving him opportunities beyond just standard diplomacy. Why did FDR do it, and what were the consequences?
The Soviets were definitely pushing hard for diplomatic recognition for several reasons. It gave them international legitimacy, prestige, it improved their access to Western money, and critically, it let them open embassies, which gave their spies legal cover, diplomatic immunity. The U.S., on the other hand, held all the cards, really. Roosevelt could have demanded they repay the $600 million in old Tsarist debts. He could have insisted they stop funding the Communist Party USA, which was actively trying to undermine the U.S. government. But he didn't. He went ahead with recognition. Seems like he was really keen to engage.
And what were the knock-on effects of that decision inside the U.S. government itself?
Well, the communist penetration of the FDR administration after 33, it was pretty significant. It was helped by the huge expansion of the New Deal agencies, which happened so fast there was almost entirely unvetted hiring. Key targets for Soviet intelligence were places like the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the Works Progress Administration, the Justice Department, even the State Department. You had agents like Lawrence Duggan, Michael Straight, Alger Hiss, who later became quite infamous. And it's interesting, right? The Communist Party USA was publicly slamming the New Deal, calling it fascism. But then Moscow told them to back off Roosevelt after the whole Popular Front idea came in around October 1935, once it suited their strategy to be friendly.
That's a stark example of how deep that influence could go. How widespread was the spying? What kind of information were they really after?
It was extensive and highly focused on military and industrial tech. Take Tupolev, the famous aircraft designer. He went on a buying expedition to U.S. aircraft factories in 1935. He had $600,000 to spend. But it wasn't just about buying planes. It was about studying them, getting the know-how. By 1938, an American engineer told the U.S. air attaché that the Russian government has agents in practically all American aircraft factories. And it wasn't just aviation. You had Richard Sorge's spy ring in Tokyo sending back invaluable intelligence about what the Japanese were planning. As one Soviet handler apparently boasted back to Moscow, "We have agents at the very center of government influencing policy." That Soviet embassy in Washington, it was way more than just a diplomatic post. It was a crucial base for intelligence operations. So against this backdrop long-term subversion, military buildup Stalin makes this tactical shift, the Popular Front against fascism. This let the USSR join the League of Nations in September 1934, even though Germany had already left. And then remarkably, Roosevelt appoints Joseph Davies as ambassador to Moscow in November 36. Davies was openly sympathetic to the Soviets. He famously flattered Stalin, telling him, "You are a greater leader than Catherine the Great, than Peter the Great, a greater leader even than Lenin."
Oh, come on, really?
Yeah, and Davies even offered to share sensitive U.S. naval intelligence with Stalin, a truly shocking breach of security.
It's just such a complex dance, isn't it? Shifting loyalties, ideology blurring when strategy demanded it. It feels like Stalin wasn't just looking for allies against fascism. He was strategically trying to wear down his capitalist rivals.
Precisely. A perfect example of that cynical strategy is Spain, the Spanish Civil War. Often painted as this clear fight against fascism, right? But Moscow's support was actually pretty limited. They sent only about 2,000 Soviet troops. Compare that to 16,000 Germans and 70,000 Italians backing Franco's nationalists. And tellingly, Soviet supplies mostly dried up after 36-37. Plus, Soviet-run purges within the Republican side seriously damaged their morale and fighting ability. By 1938, the Soviet military presence was down to just 250 guys.
Yeah.
So a cynic, thinking back to Lenin's instructions, might say Stalin's goal wasn't necessarily to win the war in Spain, but maybe to just keep it going as long as possible. Let it bleed his rivals, Germany and Italy, dry while he saved his own strength.
And what about in Asia? Did we see a similar kind of strategy play out there with Japan?
We did, yeah. In China, Stalin pushed this united front policy between the nationalists and communists. Ironically, this actually helped trigger Japan's full-scale invasion of mainland China in July 1937, after a clash near Beijing. The Japanese saw this united front as a threat, maybe a step towards a communist China. The invasion led to horrific casualties for Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, 187,200 in just the first 4 months. Meanwhile, Mao's communists. They were largely spared, often retreated, avoided big battles. Stalin's tactics seemed pretty clear. Whenever the nationals were getting hammered, the Red Army might make a small move like an incursion on the border, just enough to distract the Japanese, let the nationalists regroup a bit, then pull back, let the Chinese and Japanese slaughter each other, basically. We saw this during the Zhangufeng incident in July 38, near the Soviet-Korean border. It started small, became a real battle, and after the Soviets won that battle at Lake Khasan, Stalin just deported 200,000 ethnic Koreans in the area to Kazakhstan. Just like that, shows his ruthlessness. Even after what he framed as a defensive win. The main goal was always weakening potential rivals through attrition. #2. The huge and hateful Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, 1939 to 1940.
Okay, all this leads us to 1939, the year many in the West see as the absolute start of World War II. But even here, Stalin's actions just don't fit that simple narrative, do they? He seemed to be deliberately moving away from collective security in March 39.
Absolutely. I mean, the closer Britain, France, and Hitler got to war over Poland, the harder it was for Stalin to hide his game, right? Which was arguably to orchestrate exactly that conflict. He played a double game, quite brilliantly in a cynical way. He authorized Litvinov, his foreign minister, the guy associated with opposing Hitler, to talk about mutual aid pacts with Britain and France. While on the exact same day, he had Ambassador Merkelov reassure Germany that Soviet policy was in no way anti-German.
And then came that truly shocking signal to Hitler, an almost unbelievable reversal.
It's traumatic, yeah.
Yeah.
May 3, 1939. Suddenly, the Soviet Foreign Ministry building is surrounded by NKVD troops, the secret police. Litvinov and most of the Jewish staff are physically removed. On Stalin's direct order to Molotov, purge the Foreign Ministry of Jews.
Unbelievable.
It wasn't just changing personnel. It was an unmistakable, frankly, anti-Semitic olive branch to the Nazis, a clear sign.
Yeah.
We're open for business. No Jewish influence here.
Right. Here's where it gets really interesting. This wasn't just swapping dance partners. It was a clear signal to Hitler. An alignment of convenience, maybe even a shared taste for brutal totalitarianism. How did the Germans read these signals?
Oh, the Germans read them loud and clear. As an open invitation, Stalin was deliberately stalling talks with Britain and France. So Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, jumped right in. August 2nd, he tells a Soviet ambassador, basically, there was no problem from the Baltic to the Black Sea that couldn't be solved between us. The Soviets then clearly lost interest in the British and French offers. Molotov, Stalin's new guy, started talks with the Germans about the Polish question by August 14th and insisted the talks happen in Moscow. He even asked if Germany would be okay with the Soviet-Japanese non-aggression pact, which shows this was way bigger than just Europe.
A global strategy.
Yeah, exactly. A total reordering of power.
And then Ribbentrop arrives in Moscow. Must have been quite the scene.
Oh, it was the full red carpet treatment. Stalin himself, who rarely attended negotiations, was there. A huge contrast to the feeble show they put on for the British and French envoys, who were still just hanging around waiting. Hitler was desperate to invade Poland before the autumn mud set in. That gave Stalin massive leverage. He knew Hitler needed the pact now, and he squeezed every advantage out of that desperation.
And how did Molotov justify this pact? It must have absolutely stunned the world.
The justification was audacious. Molotov's speech to the Supreme Soviet on August 31st, 1939, laying out the new Comintern line, it was breathtaking. He openly blamed Britain for trying to embroil Germany and Soviet Russia in war, just completely twisted the reality.
That was incredible.
And then he called anyone criticizing the pact a warmonger, just inverted the whole meaning of aggression and peace.
So the pact wasn't just Stalin trying to buy time or avoid conflict. It was about orchestrating a massive land grab, a cynical carve-up of Eastern Europe with Hitler.
Absolutely. Stalin timed the Red Army's invasion of Poland very carefully. September 17, 1939. Why then? Well, it surprised both the Poles and the Germans, and crucially, it was only after the Germans had done most of the heavy fighting. basically cleared the path for the Soviets to walk in and take their share.
So it wasn't defense at all.
Not remotely. It was a calculated military move. And look at the mobilization. The Red Army mobilized across all its western districts, Finland, Baltics, White Russia, Ukraine, Romania, not just the Polish border. That showed much bigger pre-planned ambitions, way beyond just splitting Poland.
And what happened on the ground? The immediate consequences for the people caught between these two monsters.
Any illusions that the Soviets might be, benign liberators, they vanished instantly. Soviet leaflets urged Polish soldiers to kill your officers and generals, just inciting chaos. And even though the Germans had done the main fighting, there were still fierce, often forgotten battles as the Soviets advanced. They lost over 700 dead, nearly 2,000 wounded. In the German zone, the SS Einsatzgruppen, those mobile killing squads, went to work immediately, arresting and interrogating thousands of Jews, Polish elites, civil servants, doctors, priests, professors. By the end of 1939, nearly 50,000 were in concentration camps or just shot.
And in the Soviet zone, what was happening there?
In the Soviet zone, the Red Army was piggybacking on the Polish class war. They nationalized everything immediately. In Galicia alone, over 400 banks, 1,500 credit unions seized. It was basically a smaller-scale reenactment of the Ukrainian Holodomor famine, but in western Belarusia. Private farms forcibly turned into collective farms. Hundreds of thousands of farmers just herded like cattle onto them. And here's a really dark, ironic twist, almost like a communist homage to Nazi racial politics. Only people who could prove they were ethnically German were allowed to move west into the Reich from the Soviet zone. And guess who Stalin put in charge of the commission for evacuating these Germans? Litvinov, the Jewish former foreign minister he just purged.
That's just perverse.
It is. Meanwhile, Polish Jews fleeing the Nazis into Soviet towns like Lwów, initially welcomed, maybe, but many ended up facing horrors of privation and forced labor in Soviet gulag camps like Lwów, and Ukrainian nationalists. Fleeing Soviet rule, they ran west, often into the arms of the Germans. A tragic mess.
It's a stark example of how big powers can just look away from uncomfortable truths. How did Britain and France react to all this Soviet expansion?
Western apathy was, well, shocking, really. British and French leaders just seemed to swallow Molotov's lies about only reclaiming old territory. They bought into this convenient fiction to avoid getting dragged into a fight with the USSR. Foreign Minister Halifax in Britain, for instance, pulled this incredibly cynical legal move. He interpreted the Anglo-Polish Treaty, the bit that said Britain would defend Poland if attacked by a European power. He argued it only meant Germany. Russia wasn't European, apparently, for the purposes of the treaty. Very. So Britain didn't have to act. This Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact directly paved the way for Stalin to just swallow up the Baltic countries and attack Finland with no real pushback. Hashtag 3. The Winter War and Strategic Repositioning, 1939-1941. And that expansionist drive turned immediately to Finland. Stalin made these aggressive demands wanting military bases, islands like Suursaari, the Hanko Peninsula. The Finns saw it rightly as violating their sovereignty and refused. What followed was the Winter War, and it really exposed the Red Army's abysmal performance. Despite having way more troops and tanks, they took horrific casualties. They really struggled against the Finns' smart defense. It got so bad, Stalin had to intervene personally. He admitted it was a real war, much tougher than expected.
And what kind of brutal methods did he use to try and force a win?
Oh, the methods were truly brutal. Stalin set up NKVD disciplinary battalions, basically controlled detachments within Red Army units. These guys had powers of life and death over the regular soldiers. Their job was to terrorize them into fighting, shoot anyone who retreated or tried to surrender. The stories from the front are chilling. Russian soldiers apparently saying they'd rather die than fight, or begging Finns to shoot their political commissars. It shows the morale was just rock bottom. And this, of course, just made Stalin's regime look even worse internationally. The USSR actually got kicked out of the League of Nations on December 13th, 1939, the first and only country ever to suffer that ignominy. As the lead Secretary General dryly put it, Germany, Italy, and Japan had at least the decency to resign before committing flagrant aggressions.
Hard to imagine the world's supposed peace organization just disowning a major power like that. And the Soviet-Finnish War, it actually presented the Allies with opportunities, didn't it? Chances they ultimately missed.
It did, crucially. The Anglo-French Supreme War Council met on February 5, 1940. And they actually saw this war as their best shot to hit both Hitler and Stalin at the same time. They drew up plans to cut off Hitler's vital iron ore coming from Gällivare in Sweden and nickel from Petsamo in northern Finland, which the Soviets were trying to grab. The French were particularly keen. They wanted to land 50,000 Allied troops, including Polish forces, at Petsamo.
Right, this is where it gets really interesting. Supporting Finland could have turned the whole war into a fight against both kinds of totalitarianism, fascism and communism. It might have even united other powers against them. So why did they drop the ball? Why miss that chance?
It was an incredible missed opportunity. Could have totally changed the war's direction. It might have brought fascist Italy, Franco Spain, maybe even Japan over to the Allied side, potentially. Could have pulled the U.S. in sooner. But instead of going for it, the British and French War Cabinet basically changed the subject. They wanted to avoid additional military burdens. It showed a real lack of strategic vision, maybe, or perhaps just a deep reluctance to actually take on the Soviet Union directly.
So Petsamo was important strategically, but you mentioned an even more vulnerable spot for both dictators, right?
Indeed, Petsamo was key, but the real Achilles heel for both Stalin and Hitler lay further south, deep in the Soviet Union. Baku. That region supplied 3/4 of all Soviet oil. And crucially, under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that same oil was fueling Hitler's war machine.
Ah, the economic ties.
Exactly.
Yeah.
On January 6, 1940, the British War Cabinet actually discussed bombing the Soviet Caucasus oil fields. It was audacious. They worried it might provoke Stalin into moving against Iran or Afghanistan, but they still considered it. Then this pilot, Hugh MacPhail, flew a daring spy mission over Baku on March 30th, 1940. He found it was a perfect target. Wooden oil derricks, packed close together, just 70 yards apart, easily set ablaze with incendiary bombs. The French command in the Middle East hoped to launch a hammer blow on May 15, 1940. It could have crippled both Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia industrially, but the Allies missed their chance. They just kept dithering, couldn't agree to act decisively.
Wow. That's a truly critical yet fleeting opportunity, just gone. Allowed both regimes to keep building up. And Stalin certainly wasn't sitting still while the Allies dithered, was he?
Not at all. While the Allies were debating, Stalin was pressing his advantage everywhere. He started bullying Turkey aggressively on October 1st, 1939. This was right after Turkey signed a mutual aid pact with Britain and France. Stalin warned Turkey about what happened to Poland. He ominously remarked, Romania, like Poland, has too much territory. Okay. And he demanded Turkey stay neutral if Britain or France attacked the USSR. Clear signs of his immediate expansion plans.
And when Germany launched its big offensive in Western Europe in 1940, how did Stalin react? Did he want a quick German win?
Well, Molotov was initially reported as being delighted when Germany attacked France in May 1940. But that delight quickly turned to alarm when he saw how fast the Germans were moving. Stalin had a clear preference. He wanted a slow, grinding, bloody battle of attrition in the West, something that would weaken both sides, Germany and the Allies, leaving the Soviet Union relatively stronger. He definitely didn't want a quick, decisive German victory, but even though he was alarmed, he kept expanding. The Soviets invaded Romania and Bessarabia and northern Bukovina by force in June 1940. Locals fled in panic, remembering the Ukrainian Holodomor famine, as the Soviets brought the blessings of communism, which meant looting banks, seizing property, mass deportations.
So it really paints a picture of Stalin not just reacting defensively, but proactively grabbing territory, reshaping his western borders while Germany was busy elsewhere. How did the Germans feel about this Soviet creeping expansion?
Oh, German alarm was definitely growing. Seeing the Soviets move into Finland, the Baltics, Romania, it made them very nervous. This led Germany to flood those countries with military advisors. And they signed a formal military defense agreement with Finland on September 27, 1940. These moves laid the groundwork for future alliances against the USSR. The tension between the supposed partners was clearly ratcheting up.
And this proactive expansion continued with Molotov's visit to Berlin later that year. What did that trip reveal about Stalin's wider ambitions?
The welcome Molotov got in Berlin in November 1940 was lavish. Again, a stark contrast to the cool reception Western diplomats were getting. Stalin himself attended the talks again, which was rare, showing how important he thought this was. And he gave Molotov secret instructions. Keep quietly demoralizing German troops in the various countries. Chilling, right? Still running subversive ops even while negotiating with Hitler. He also used the visit to bully Bulgaria into accepting a mutual assistance pact, threatening they would perish otherwise. He even offered to back Bulgarian claims against Turkey and Greece, saying bluntly, "We shall drive the Turks into Asia."
Wow, so this wasn't just about borders in Europe?
Not at all. It clearly showed Stalin's long-term vision. Broader geopolitical dominance, a truly imperialistic ambition masked by communist rhetoric.
So this wasn't defense, it was pure expansion. And backing that up, you said, was this enormous military buildup. Can you give us a sense of the Red Army's actual strength leading up to 1941?
The scale was truly formidable by the end of 1940, especially when you compare it to Germany at the time. The Red Army had 23,307 operational tanks, 15,000 anti-tank guns, 22,171 warplanes. And get this, the Red Air Force was already the world's largest before 1939. Then they ordered another 10,362 new planes in 1940 and a staggering 20,150 more ordered for 1941.
That's insane numbers compared to Germany.
Well, the Wehrmacht had only about 3,387 Panzers before they invaded France. The Luftwaffe used maybe 1,800 planes in the Battle of Britain. The Soviet buildup was just on a completely different scale.
That's a really stark refutation of the common idea of an unprepared Soviet Union, isn't it? The sheer scale and the offensive nature of this buildup, it's truly eye-opening. Were there other signs pointing towards attack, not just defense?
Absolutely. Stalin's priorities in aircraft production shifted, which was very telling.
Yeah.
He moved away from long-range heavy bombers towards cheaper, mass-produced, low-flying light bombers, like the Su-2 and the famous Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack plane. The Sturmovik, interestingly, was based on an American Volt-E prototype they'd acquired.
Technology transfer again.
Right. This shift strongly suggests a focus on supporting ground troops in an offensive, not strategic bombing. Plus, the way they deployed their forces, concentrating them heavily in European Russia, especially in the newly grabbed territories right up against the German border. It all pointed towards planning for a European war pitting the USSR against a German-led coalition. Even Marshal Timoshenko's mobilization plan from August 1940, while it talked defense publicly, still masked the main forces in the West, ready to move forward. All the signs pointed to an army geared up for attack, not just sitting back waiting. By April 1941, pretty much everyone expected a Soviet-German clash. Not just military guys, but leaders like Churchill, too. Churchill was actually hoping Hitler would make the mistake of invading the USSR. He even shared genuine ultra-intelligence, those decrypted German military messages with Stalin back on April 19, 1941. He told Stalin about German troop movements, like 5 tank divisions moving to Poland, trying to warn him.
Did Stalin listen?
Seems not enough. German strength on the Eastern Front was building up 60 divisions by late April 93 by early June. But they were still massively outnumbered by the Red Army's estimated 150 divisions packed onto that western frontier. German spy planes, the Luftwaffe, were flying over constantly. 80 violations between late March and mid-April. One German plane was even forced it down in western Ukraine, and guess what? It had Soviet topographical maps on board, clearly scouting.
Okay, so the Soviets definitely knew about the German buildup, the rising tension. But here's the absolute bombshell, the thing that really changes the story. That Timoshenko and Zhukov war plan from May 15th, 1941. A document many didn't know about until relatively recently. What did it actually say?
This document is absolutely critical to understanding the situation. Timoshenko and Zhukov's plan from May 15th, it explicitly talks about launching a sudden blow, or a preventive preemptive strike. The goal, to forestall the adversary, while the German army was still getting into position, still deploying, and their objectives were incredibly aggressive. Startlingly so. They expected the Red Army to reach Lodz, Krakow in Poland, and Olomouc in Czechoslovakia, that's only 100 miles from Vienna, within 30 days.
Wow.
The aim was to cut Germany off from its allies in the south, and then follow up with an offensive into Hungary and Romania to grab the Ploiești oil fields. This wasn't a plan for defense. It was a detailed blueprint for a massive offensive invasion.
That is just, an aha moment that changes everything. If Stalin was actively planning his own preemptive strike, how does that fundamentally mess with the usual story? The narrative of a totally unprovoked, surprise German attack on an unsuspecting victim.
It shifts the narrative dramatically, doesn't it? The standard Western view often paints the Soviet Union as this completely surprised, innocent victim of German aggression. But this war plan, it reveals Stalin wasn't just digging trenches. He was poised for his own massive offensive, aiming to use the war in Europe to grab more territory, expand Soviet power. So the German invasion, Barbarossa, however brutal and aggressive it was, it might have simply beaten Stalin to the punch, turned Stalin from the potential aggressor into the victim, literally overnight.
And this intention, it wasn't just buried in secret military plans, was it? Stalin himself seemed to signal this shift towards offense quite publicly.
He did. That speech he gave on May 5th, 1941 to military academy graduates, hugely significant, cannot be overstated. He explicitly ditched his peace policy rhetoric. He said, quote, "The era of the peace policy is at an end. Not another foot of ground can be gained with such peaceful sentiments." Extremely blunt. A clear public statement of intent. We're going to take territory by force. Even as he was prepping for this potential clash, he even kind of dissed German military tech, called their tanks inferior. Said the Luftwaffe was overtaken by Americans. Despite Germany's recent blitzkrieg successes, it shows this staggering level of overconfidence in his own military machine and his own grand strategy. And in spring 1941, the Politburo just intensified everything. Resolutions pouring out for more weapons procurement, huge increases in T-34 and KV tanks, more anti-tank guns, MiG fighters, light bombers, and crucially, rapid construction of tank parks, fuel depots, right near the German border, all gearing up for this planned offensive. The NKVD, the secret police, even ran this massive program to build new airfields. They drafted 25,000 laborers in April, another 100,000 in May 41. And get this, 80% of these new air bases were deliberately positioned within a few minutes flying distance of the German Reich.
And just before the invasion, as a grim sort of prelude, we see the NKVD carrying out mass arrests and deportations in those newly grabbed border zones. What was that about? Cleansing the decks before the attack.
That's exactly what it looks like. These were ruthless actions. A regime getting ready for a massive war by eliminating any potential internal dissent, any fifth column, especially among the Poles and Ukrainians they just recently conquered. Look at the numbers. Nearly 20,000 suspected enemy agents arrested and deported from Moldavia. Over 34,000 from Lithuania, 12,000 from Estonia, almost 15,000 from Latvia, and that included over 3,000 children under 6.
Jesus, children under 6.
Yeah. It wasn't just paranoia, it was systematic cleansing, ensuring absolute control before launching a huge military operation. The final sign, increased NKVD vigilance on the border on June 20, 1941. All furloughs canceled. Something was clearly imminent.
Okay, so despite this massive buildup, this offensive planning, the actual German invasion on June 22nd, 1941, Operation Barbarossa, it was still utterly devastating for the Red Army initially. What went so wrong? How did that happen?
Yeah, the devastating verdict on the Red Army's forward deployment came incredibly fast. In the first hours and days, thousands of Soviet warplanes were just jammed together on those relatively few airfields that were actually finished, lined up like fish in a barrel, as one source put it. Easy pickings for the Luftwaffe. Same with the tanks and fuel dumps. Hundreds of half-finished, uncamouflaged tank parks and petrol stations right near the border, exposed. The losses were just catastrophic. By July 9th, just a couple of weeks in, they'd lost 11,700 tanks, 19,000 cannons and mortars. By the end of July, 10,000 Soviet warplanes gone. That's over 4 times the Luftwaffe's total strength on the Eastern Front.
Unbelievable losses.
German journalists in mid-July were reporting they didn't see a single Soviet airplane in the sky over the territory they captured. Stalin's overconfidence, his aggressive forward deployment, ironically, it played right into Hitler's hands, turned his planned offensive into a desperate, catastrophic defense.
And behind those collapsing front lines, advancing German troops started discovering truly horrific things, didn't they?
They did. The horrors found behind the retreating Soviet lines were shocking. In Lvov, or Lemberg as the Germans called it, they found evidence that the NKVD had butchered around 3,500 political prisoners right before pulling out. German sources reported it, and later Soviet sources actually admitted to over 2,400 executions there. This massacre was so bad, it actually led many locals to initially welcome the Germans as liberators.
Wow.
That puts a different spin on things.
It does. In another town, Tarnopol, they found 200 bodies in a prison cellar, 300 more buried shallowly in a Jewish cemetery. A discovery in 1990 traced 500 corpses there back to NKVD mass executions. Another 890 murdered in a place called Jortko.
These numbers are just chilling. What was the estimated scale of these massacres right at the start of the invasion? And what does this level of brutality tell us about Stalin's regime, even as it was fighting for its life?
The estimates suggest somewhere between 20,000 and 24,000 unarmed political prisoners, Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, were executed by the NKVD just in June 1941. That's a scale comparable to the infamous Katyn massacre of Polish officers. It reveals a regime driven by this hypersensitive precautionary mindset, and Stalin's personal preternatural loathing of Poles, who he saw as a strong nation and a constant threat. And this brutality wasn't just reserved for perceived internal enemies. Advancing German units reported seeing summary executions of German prisoners by Soviet troops. Many horribly mutilated, castrated, eyes gouged out, tongues cut off, burned alive. A German medical column was reportedly butchered near Minsk. And throughout the war, Molotov consistently refused any mediation on treating POWs, wouldn't even respond to the International Red Cross. It underlines the regime's utter disregard for international law, for basic human life. Even in the face of invasion, it really complicates that simple picture of the Soviet Union as purely a victim, shows the brutal reality of the state fighting for survival.
It's a truly stark and horrifying picture. Given this absolute catastrophe unfolding, how did Stalin's regime even react? Did they have any backup plans for this kind of collapse?
Surprisingly, yes. The scale of the initial disaster was so huge they actually put drastic contingency plans into action within days. Stalin authorized measures for dealing with defeat as early as June 23, 1941, just one day after the invasion started, including setting up an evacuation committee for Moscow itself. Secret orders went out on June 27th for this monumental task: ship entire critical war factories east, like the huge steel plant from Mariupol all the way to Magnitogorsk in the Urals, along with their managers, engineers, key workers. In total, over 1,500 factories were moved, wholly or partly. That was maybe 8–10% of their entire pre-war industrial capacity. Required an incredible 1.6 million railway cars.
1.6 million railway cars during an invasion. That's almost unimaginable logistics. What else did they evacuate?
Pretty much everything valuable. The State Diamond Fund, all the Kremlin treasures, including the old Tsarist Romanov jewels, they were shipped off to places like Chelyabinsk and Sverdlovsk. Even Lenin's embalmed body got packed up and sent east to Tyumen for safekeeping.
Wow, Lenin on a train.
Right. And the Politburo ordered a full-on scorched earth campaign on June 27th. The order was, all valuable property, raw materials, or food stocks, anything which might be used by the enemy must be reduced to total disrepair, that is, destroyed, annihilated, and burned. End quote. That included burning billions of rubles from the state bank. And they evacuated people too. Over 500,000 skilled workers from military industries and their families from Moscow and Leningrad alone. Over 1 million people moved east. It's a testament to just how bad the initial collapse was, and to Stalin's cold, brutal pragmatism that they implemented these drastic measures within days. So, as the Soviet Union is just reeling from this invasion, the Western Allies are facing their own tough choices. Churchill, already fighting Hitler, was certainly hoping Hitler would make this blunder, invade the USSR, keep Britain from being totally isolated. He even shared that genuine ultra-intelligence with Stalin back in April 41 about the German buildup, trying to prevent a collapse. The U.S. ambassador in Moscow, Lawrence Steinhardt, had warned back in March 41 that Stalin is hypnotized by the bogey of Allied intervention in the Caucasus while he is still entangled in Finland. Shows a deep mistrust even before Barbarossa hit. Despite all this, FDR, with his famous Great Arsenal of Democracy speech in late 1940, launched the Lend-Lease program to supply Allied nations. And controversially, he lifted the moral embargo on strategic exports to the USSR in January 41. He started approving Soviet import orders through his key aide, Harry Hopkins, often bypassing the regular State Department channels.
Right. It's hard to square giving that level of aid with the brutality we just talked about, and the fact that Stalin, as we've seen, was likely planning his own attack. Now, many argue Lend-Lease was just pure pragmatism, right? Defeat Hitler first. But you're hinting there might have been more to it, a flawed understanding, maybe even some ideological sympathy driving Western policy towards Stalin. Can you unpack that?
That's a really crucial point, yeah. There was significant opposition inside the U.S. to helping Stalin, particularly from what one source calls an articulate minority led by questionably motivated members of the Roman Catholic Church. Lots of Polish and Irish Catholics who were acutely aware of Soviet atrocities, their anti-religious stance. And remarkably, Harry Hopkins actually suggested playing up the anti-religious part of the Nazi policy to counteract this opposition.
Even though Stalin ran the first officially atheist state that actively persecuted religion.
It's quite a twist. Furthermore, the U.S. military attaché in Moscow at the time, Colonel Ivan Yeaton, he believed Stalin not only knew he was going to be attacked, but he was warned of the date. Yeaton thought Stalin deliberately let it look like a surprise to avoid admitting he couldn't stop it, or maybe couldn't launch his own attack first. So that narrative of the completely surprised innocent victim wasn't universally believed even then. The Allies' motives were complex, a mix of pragmatism, definitely wanting Hitler beaten, but also perhaps a convenient blindness to Stalin's real nature, or maybe a misguided hope they could somehow manage him, make him a reliable partner after the war.
And encouraged by Roosevelt's envoy, Hopkins, Stalin certainly took full advantage of this aid. What was he demanding? And how fast did he go from being on the ropes to calling the shots?
The speed was remarkable. He started making direct, almost commanding demands to Harry Hopkins. He needed anti-aircraft guns, heavy machine guns, rifles, over 1 million rifles, and huge amounts of aluminum, first 5,000 tons and 2,500 tons a month. He told Hopkins quite bluntly, "Give us anti-aircraft guns and the aluminum and we can fight for 3 or 4 years.
Just like that, a shopping list.
Pretty much. He also insisted that Russian engineers get free rein to travel the U.S., study American weapons, factories, techniques, while American experts. Strictly forbidden from studying Soviet equipment or even seeing how Lend-Lease stuff was being used. Total one-way street. It really is amazing how quickly Stalin went from nearly collapsing under the German attack to dictating terms, demanding massive aid. A real strategic pivot that cemented his role as this crucial, if deeply problematic, ally. But this Lend-Lease aid, even though it was vital, the Soviet leadership increasingly saw it as kind of a cheap Anglo-American substitute for engaging German armies more directly. Stalin started pushing for a second front somewhere in the Balkans or France, talking to Churchill as early as September 3, 1941. That's even before the U.S. was officially in the war. He just kept hammering on it, convinced it would take the pressure off his armies.
Right. And how did Churchill and later Roosevelt handle these constant demands for a second front? It became a real sore point in the alliance, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Churchill tried to deflect, offering things like not charging for British weapons, arranging the dangerous Arctic convoys, using the Royal Navy. But that only made Stalin's demands louder and shriller. Then Roosevelt, maybe a bit impulsively, made this reckless promise of a second front during Molotov's visit to Washington in May 1942. That caused huge friction with the British because FDR hadn't cleared it with Churchill first. Big oops. So then Churchill, not wanting to be outdone, basically overbid Roosevelt. He promised a large-scale invasion of the continent of Europe by British and American forces in 1943 with over 1 million men. Even though he probably knew, realistically, that wasn't feasible given the logistics at the time. This whole second front issue just became this constant lever for Stalin to pull, highlighting the tension and deep mistrust bubbling under the surface of the Grand Alliance. Stalin always pushing for more, faster. Now, despite that initial Barbarossa disaster, the Moscow Miracle in late 41 was absolutely pivotal. Stalin pulled 11 Soviet divisions off the Manchurian border, sent them west to defend Moscow. How did he know it was safe? Because Richard Sorge, his master spy in Tokyo, sent intelligence confirming Japan was not going to attack the USSR. They were looking south toward Southeast Asia and the Pacific.
Ah, the spies again. Crucial intelligence.
Absolutely crucial. And these Siberian divisions, they were veterans of fighting the Japanese at Khalkhin Gol, elite troops. They punched well above their weight in stopping the Germans just outside Moscow.
And the role of Lend-Lease in the Stalingrad turning point Operation Uranus, that's a really powerful counter to the idea that the Soviets just won through sheer numbers, the human wave thing, right?
It absolutely is. The success of Operation Uranus, that brilliant encirclement of the German 6th Army at Stalingrad, it was heavily reliant on Lend-Lease. The operation used 70,000 American trucks and jeeps. Think about the mobility they gave them. And 500,000 tons of American aviation fuel, motor fuel, lubricants. In fact, temporary shortages of exactly those items forced them to postpone the start of the operation by 10 days. Shows how vital it was.
Wow, didn't know that.
Yeah. And the tanks, too, often overlooked. By mid-November 1942, just before Uranus kicked off, they'd received nearly 4,500 U.S. and British tanks and gun carriers. Things like Canadian Valentines, British Matildas, American Stuarts and Shermans, even Bren gun carriers. Some models of the Sherman tank were even designed exclusively for the Red Army, based on Soviet requests. Without that massive logistical and material support from the West, it's really debatable if Stalingrad could have happened, let alone succeeded. The sheer volume of stuff was critical. But despite getting all this life-saving aid, Stalin's ingratitude, his political maneuvering, it was constant and striking. He just flatly refused to go to the Casablanca conference in January 43. Said he was too busy with Stalingrad. And later he tried to stir up trouble about the Allies' dealings with Admiral Darlan in North Africa, basically trying to sow discord between Roosevelt and Churchill. Then came the Katyn massacre affair in April 43. The Germans found those mass graves of thousands of Polish officers near Smolensk, clearly executed by the Soviets earlier. Radio Berlin broadcasts it, talks about the bestially murdered Poles. Radio Moscow immediately denies it, blames German fascist hangmen.
And how did the Polish government in exile, based in London, react to finding their missing officers like that?
They asked for an investigation by the International Red Cross. A perfectly reasonable request, right? Moscow immediately denounced as villainous tricks, which frankly strongly suggested Stalin's guilt. He then just broke off relations with the Polish exile government, calling them pro-fascist collaborators trying to grab Soviet territory. Just slander. And publicly. Stalin consistently refused to even acknowledge the Lend-Lease contributions, despite the U.S. ambassador, Admiral Stanley, complaining publicly that the Soviets were deliberately concealing the U.S. contribution from their own people. Stalin didn't seem to care about flattering press in the U.S. either, like Time making him Man of the Year in 42, refused interviews, book deals, total indifference.
Which brings us back to that question, why did Roosevelt keep up this unconditional courtship of Stalin? Despite the obvious ingratitude, the lies, the brutality like Keaton, was it just naivete, or was it a calculated long game from FDR too?
It's still one of the big debates, isn't it? complex and deeply controversial. Some argue, yes, it was a form of naivete, a belief that personal charm, generosity could somehow win Stalin over, make him a reliable post-war partner. Others argue it was calculated, prioritizing the defeat of Germany above absolutely everything else, even if that meant enabling a powerful, potentially hostile Soviet empire in the East. Roosevelt was also very focused on creating his post-war international organization, the United Nations. He saw Soviet cooperation as absolutely essential for that to work.
So the UN dream trumped Polish freedom are facing facts about Stalin.
It seems that goal might have led him to overlook, or at least downplay, Stalin's cynical power plays, his internal horrors. He consistently put the immediate war effort and this vision of future peace through the UN, ahead of confronting Stalin on moral issues or territory, effectively kicking those cans down the road. And that decision to prioritize cooperation, it played out directly in just how much aid kept flowing. U.S. aid shipments to Stalin actually escalated to almost unfathomable levels in late 43 and early 44. 6 million tons of stuff, planes, tanks, trucks, weapons, ammo, industrial gear, metals, food shipped during the Third Protocol period, July of 43 to June 44. That was nearly double the amount they sent when the Soviets were really on the ropes, back in 41 and 42.
And the logistics just to get it there must have been staggering.
Absolutely immense. The Pacific routes, especially into Vladivostok, were carrying up to 600,000 tons of supplies a month by late 43, early 44. The total shipped across the Pacific, 8.244 million tons. That equals the entire volume shipped across the North Atlantic for the whole war.
That's incredible.
It really suggests deep geopolitical thinking by the U.S., a commitment to propping up Soviet power, maybe for post-war stability or influence or just to finish off Germany faster.
And Harry Hopkins, FDR's right-hand man, was key to this massive flow of aid. What was his thinking?
Hopkins was definitely an articulate propagandist for all-out aid to Russia. He genuinely seemed to believe that Russia's post-war position in Europe will be a dominant one. And therefore, Russia must be given every assistance and every effort must be made to obtain her friendship. General Marshall even commented that Hopkins' job effectively became to represent the Russian interests to the president, and the aid reshaped American industries, the U.S. pork and meat canning industry, radically altered to meet Soviet demand for Spam. Spam made up 13% of all U.S. production by mid-1943.
Spam, wow.
Yeah, significant chunks of other food, too. Dried eggs, 15.3%, dried fruit, 15.7%, beans, 16.8%. By 1944, U.S. aid was providing 70% of all Russian sugar consumption. The scale was just unprecedented.
It really is astounding, the sheer volume of American resources poured into the Soviet war effort, even when the immediate danger seemed to be receding. Suggests a very deliberate policy. But it wasn't just food and trucks, was it? There was this huge transfer of American technology, too.
Oh, yeah. Soviet requests for American tech were described as brazen. They got $500 million worth of industrial equipment that's like $50 billion today. Machine tools, electric furnaces, entire oil refineries, steel rolling mills. They also demanded complete technical information and technological drawings for advanced stuff, like synthetic rubber plants capable of making 38,000 tons a year.
And this even included sensitive materials related to atomic energy, didn't it?
Yes. There was this guy, Major Jordan, who testified after the war about shipments of atomic materials, beryllium, cadmium, cobalt, aluminum tubes, other strategic metals being shipped to Siberia, under guard by armed Soviet agents. His claims were initially dismissed, but later largely confirmed by declassified Venona intercepts. They revealed this systematic Soviet effort to get atomic and other advanced tech, both through Lend-Lease and espionage. And despite all this, the Russians consistently refused to let the U.S. even see how the supplies were being used. Ambassador Harriman complained the Russians do not consider themselves called upon to do anything that would be helpful to our forces in return. But Hopkins' justification for just keep giving, apparently it was. The way to get along with the Russians is to do everything they ask.
So that raises the question again. Was this level of tech transfer incredibly naive? Or was it some calculated move by the Americans to gain post-war leverage? Either way, it undoubtedly boosted Soviet industrial and tech power for decades.
Hard to know the exact motive mix. Probably a bit of both. But the result was clear. It massively accelerated Soviet industrial and military recovery and development, directly fed into their post-war strength. And this reality, this growing Soviet power, it really came to a head at the Tehran Conference in November 1943. Roosevelt, maybe still thinking he could charm Stalin personally, really wanted a one-on-one summit without Churchill, even suggested meeting near Alaska. He ended up meeting Stalin before Churchill at Tehran. a symbolic gesture showing he wanted that direct relationship. And it was at Tehran, at Churchill's birthday dinner, that Stalin made one of his rare acknowledgments of Lend-Lease. He toasted American industry, saying, without the United States as a source of motors, this war would have been lost.
And the actual agreement that came out of Tehran, the Eureka communique, that was pretty much the blueprint for how Europe would be divided, wasn't it? A truly pivotal moment, deciding the fate of Eastern Europe long before the war ended, largely on Stalin's terms.
It really was. The U.S. and Britain committed fully to Operation Overlord at the D-Day landings on the Channel coast, and Operation Anvil in southern France. Crucially, they explicitly ruled out advancing up through Italy or the Balkans into Central Europe.
Why was that so critical?
Because that southern route might have allowed the British and Americans to reach Germany long before the Red Army, end of quote. By choosing the cross-channel invasion, they effectively guaranteed Stalin a free hand as the Red Army rolled west into Eastern Europe and the Balkans. A massive strategic concession. And during these talks, Stalin laid out his demands for Poland's borders to be shifted way west. And for chunks of Germany, like East Prussia, Roosevelt and Churchill, they didn't object, basically greenlighting Stalin's territorial grabs.
So by the time they get to Yalta in February 1945, the whole strategic picture has shifted dramatically in Stalin's favor. He's holding all the high cards, and he forces a very sick Roosevelt to come all the way to him, right?
Absolutely. Stalin just refused to leave the USSR. So Roosevelt, who was clearly a sick and dying man by this point, had to make this grueling 14,000-mile round trip to the Crimea in high winter. His doctors had forbidden him flying above 6,000 feet because of his blood pressure, made the journey incredibly risky, involved a dangerous flight over the Adriatic, the Aegean, risk of getting shot at by Soviet Black Sea batteries, which actually did happen to a British plane around that time, then a 5-hour, bone-jarring car ride over terrible roads from the airport to Yalta. Churchill famously gripped, "If we had spent 10 years in our research, we could not have found a worse place in the world than Yalta."
So the location itself was a power play by Stalin. And what was the military reality on the ground by then? That must have strengthened Stalin's position even more.
Oh, hugely. And the palaces where they met. Renovated by thousands of NKVD-directed construction crews, mostly prisoners of war, including Romanians, a grim backdrop. Strategically, everything was going Stalin's way. The controversial Morgenthau plan for Germany had actually backfired, stiffening German resistance in the West, arguably contributing to the Battle of the Bulge. Meanwhile, the Red Army had taken Belgrade. Their massive Vistula-Oder offensive had brought them within 40 miles of Berlin. They'd captured Königsberg, Gdańsk. They took Warsaw in January 45, by then just a depopulated pile of rubble. They liberated Auschwitz-Birkenau. By Yalta, Stalin truly held all the cards east of the Oder River.
And in that context, Roosevelt's apparent willingness to concede on Poland and on the fate of Allied POWs held by the Soviets, that's a really critical and deeply controversial part of Yalta, isn't it?
It is. Roosevelt seemed intensely focused on his United Nations project, and he made huge concessions to get Stalin on board. Stalin got a full veto power in the UN Security Council, immense post-war power, and the promise of 3 votes for the USSR in the General Assembly: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, which completely violated the one nation, one vote principle FDR himself had championed.
3 votes? How?
Stalin argued they'd suffered so much it was a pure power play, and Roosevelt agreed. Perhaps most controversially, the decision was made to forcibly repatriate Soviet POWs and civilians found in Allied zones, the Osttruppen, send them back to Stalin. Even though the Allies knew they faced certain imprisonment and likely death, Stalin explicitly said he wanted them back to make them answer for their actions. Churchill promised to send back all categories.
Yeah.
A terrible decision. Stalin and Molotov even accused Roosevelt of going soft on the Germans during talks about Italy's surrender earlier, demanding the talks stop. Just constant pressure and suspicion.
So that question again, was Roosevelt just outmaneuvered because he was sick and obsessed with the UN? Or were these concessions seen as the necessary ugly price for getting Soviet cooperation to end the war and build any kind of post-war order?
It's still fiercely debated by historians. Some argue, look, the Red Army was already occupying Eastern Europe. What leverage did FDR really have? Others insist his focus on the UN, combined with his failing health, led to critical misjudgments, huge giveaways. The underlying hope, it seems, was that Soviet cooperation was essential for a lasting peace, and this was the price. But the consequences were profound, weren't they? Set the stage for the Cold War, decades of division, immense suffering in Eastern Europe, #7, the spoils of war and a new world order. 1945 onwards.
So the war in Europe grinds towards its end. The Red Army is closing in on Berlin. General Eisenhower makes that strategic call, let the Russians take the city. And Stalin, always competitive, basically pits his marshals, Zhukov and Konev, against each other in a race to capture the German capital. Race the Americans too, of course.
Yeah, the final assault on Berlin starting April 16th, 1945. It was just brutal, ferocious, met by this incredible German resistance, scorched earth defense, Hitler's orders. The Red Army casualties just in the Battle of Berlin were staggering. Over 360,000 casualties, nearly 100,000 dead, 2,000 tanks lost, thousands of guns, hundreds of planes. That's almost 4 times the number of casualties the U.S. took in the entire Battle of the Bulge. Just puts the scale of the fighting into perspective.
Incredible price for that final victory.
Absolutely. And it highlights how strategically crucial Berlin was for Stalin's vision of total victory. The hammer and sickle finally went up over the Reichstag on May 2nd. The Germans surrendered to Zhukov on May 8th.
But Stalin's goals went way beyond just military victory in Berlin, didn't they? It was about seizing Germany's industrial heart.
Oh, absolutely. After the surrender, Stalin took over 2 million German soldiers prisoner. But his real prize wasn't just manpower. It was Germany's industrial wealth, the factories, the patents, the engineers, the manufacturing secrets. The Yalta Agreement had okayed $10 billion in Soviet reparations from Germany, cash, goods, forced labor. But Stalin intended to take far, far more.
And he actually had a dedicated army unit just for this systematic plunder, a war booty army. Tell us about that.
It's almost unbelievable, the scale of it. This dedicated war booty army had been operating within the Red Army since January 1943. It had specialized looting battalions, looting brigades. By 1945, this force had 5 trains assigned exclusively for hauling loot, equipped with heavy tractors, cranes, many of them, ironically, American Lend-Lease equipment.
Using Lend-Lease gear to loot Germany?
Exactly. They had 80,000 men assigned to forced labor battalions just for this task. And to make sure they got the really valuable stuff, this booty army was reinforced with hundreds of Soviet engineers, technicians, master builders, skilled workers for what they called delicate extractions, taking apart entire factories piece by piece. By the end of 1946, they had carted off 4.15 million tons of industrial, commercial, artistic, intellectual property from Germany alone, filled over 500,000 railway wagons. The total war booty, by the end of 1947, exceeded 9.991 million tons. Equipment, inventory, patents from 1.2 million German factories. Big names like Siemens, BMW, Alliance, stripped bare. So it raises that question again. Was this just payback for Soviet war losses? Or was it a deliberate, systematic plan to transfer Europe's industrial might to the USSR, to build Soviet power by dismantling Germany's?
And this looting wasn't just confined to Germany, was it?
No, not at all. The plunder was systematic across Eastern Europe. Over 211,000 railway wagons filled with stuff taken from Poland, 31,000 from Austria, thousands more from Hungary, Czechoslovakia. It was a massive organized transfer of wealth and industrial capacity right across the region.
And what about the human cost of this post-war liberation in occupied Germany itself?
Oh, the horrors of the post-war liberation in Germany were widely reported, truly devastating. There was this Soviet propagandist, Ilya Ehrenberg, apparently Stalin's favorite rabble-rouser, who explicitly urged Red Army soldiers to kill Germans, hang them, burn their homes, enjoy the flames, just inciting atrocities directly. It fueled this horrific cycle of atrocity and counter-atrocity. And then came the mass expulsions. Over 6 million ethnic Germans, mostly women, children, old people, forcibly driven out of places like Prussia, which Poland then absorbed. Another 6 million German speakers expelled from Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia. Estimates have that somewhere between 500,000 and 1.5 million civilians died during this forgotten mass deportation. A truly chilling legacy. Shows the brutal reality for ordinary people caught up in the Red Army's advance and the brutal redrawing of Europe's map. And the impact of Stalin's war, it stretched dramatically into Asia too. Laid the seeds for the Cold War there. Truman, when he took over from Roosevelt, started shifting policy. He wasn't unconditionally pro-Stalin like FDR seemed to be. He listened to advisors like Joseph Crew, who argued for maybe revising the unconditional surrender terms for Japan, and for revisiting those Yalta promises about Manchuria going to Stalin, which broke earlier promises made to Chiang Kai-shek at Cairo.
And, incredibly, Lend-Lease aid to the Soviets kept flowing after Germany surrendered, even though the USSR wasn't even at war with Japan until the very last minute, August 1945. Why keep supplying their armies in the Far East?
Yeah, Lend-Lease continued for essential Soviet military requirements in the Far East. even though they weren't fighting Japan. Over 4 million tons of war supplies were shipped to Soviet Far Eastern armies in the last 14 months of the Pacific War. That's equal to the entire volume shipped across the Atlantic during the whole war against Germany.
That's astounding.
Meanwhile, Stalin knew all about the Manhattan Project, the U.S. atomic bomb, through his spies Klaus Fuchs, David Greenglass, Theodore Hall, Oscar Saborer. This knowledge sped up the Soviet bomb program, and it convinced Stalin he needed to enter the war against Japan sooner rather than later to grab territory before the U.S. finished Japan off alone. He moved his planned invasion, Operation August Storm, up from late August to mid-August 45. Truman did show some firmness later, drawing lines insisting the Soviets stay out of Hokkaido and Japan, setting the 38th Parallel Division in Korea. That probably saved millions from falling under Soviet control. But still, Stalin's armies conquered 40 million people in Manchuria, captured 640,000 Japanese POWs, over 62,000 died in Soviet camps, and they looted nearly $2 billion worth of industrial property from Manchuria. Plus, the horrific stories of mass rapes of Japanese women by Soviet troops started emerging too, another grim liberation.
Which really raises that final question. Did the way the Allies handled the end of the Pacific War, especially continuing that massive lend-lease to Stalin, the deals made about Asian territories, did it inadvertently help pave the way for communism to spread across Asia, even as they were fighting to free those same areas from Japanese oppression? And you have to factor in the role of those Soviet agents of influence, like Harry Dexter White in the U.S. Treasury, maybe even Hopkins. China, fighting Japan for years, got only 1–2% of lend-lease compared to Russia. And Soviet wartime debts, basically written off for 2 pennies on the dollar in 1951. While Britain, a key ally, paid its lend-lease debts back in full right up until 2006. Quite a contrast. Hashtag tag outro.
Wow. We have definitely unpacked a truly staggering amount of information today, challenging that standard narrative of World War II, urging you really to consider this different perspective. Whose war was it, truly? We've seen how Stalin's long game, his opportunistic alliances, that massive military buildup, his absolutely ruthless drive for expansion, how all that fundamentally shaped the conflict and everything that came after.
Way more than many Western histories usually acknowledge.
Yeah, and if you connect all that to the bigger picture, it really forces you to ask some tough questions, doesn't it? Was the main goal of the war really just about defeating fascism, or did it also become, maybe unconsciously for the Western Allies, about containing German power at any cost? Even if that cost was inadvertently helping another brutal totalitarian empire rise in its place, it makes you reconsider the long-term consequences of those wartime decisions, and whether that simple good war narrative might hide some deeply uncomfortable truths about who really won, who lost, and the world order that was forged in the process.
So for you, the learner, this deep dive really shows that history is rarely, if ever, a simple story of good guys versus bad guys. There are always more layers to peel back, more perspectives to think about, and definitely more sometimes uncomfortable questions to ask. What other historical narratives might you look at again with this kind of critical lens, pushing beyond the accepted story? Until next time, keep digging, keep questioning, and keep deep diving into the stories that shape our world.